As the Chicago Bears cut down to their initial 53-man roster today, the tough decisions ahead of them are a good reminder of how far they've come and how much more talent is on the roster right now than there was a year ago.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. On the show today, we look at where the Bears stand now compared to where they were last year on Cutdown Day, where the decisions feel a bit more difficult this time around, and the players they're deciding between are better than some of the same decisions they were having to make a year ago. So we'll look at what those difficult decisions are now, what they were before, and how the changes to the key players on this roster really do stack up now that we know exactly what these teams are going to look like entering the regular season. This time of year is always a little bit of a tricky one for putting out podcasts because we could talk about the Bears roster moves specifically, but as this podcast comes out Tuesday morning, and then maybe depending on what time you listen to it on Tuesday, they'll make a lot of those cuts during the day. So rather than trying to hey, update you on what we knew so far from Monday and what could still be in the case, I want to go a little bit bigger picture here on where this team is now, and then compare that to where this team was a year ago. I want to start with some of the more difficult decisions that the Bears are facing right now so that we can use that as a comparison point to the kind of decisions Ryan Poles had to make on this 53-man roster last year. So for example, when you look across this Bears roster, there's only a handful of spots where it's really neck and neck on really hard to predict who's going to make the team. I think the one that stands out right away on offense is sort of the kick returner conversation where Velus Jones finds himself on the running back depth chart and the wide receiver depth chart. Is he the fourth running back, or is Travis Homer the fourth running back? And if Travis Homer is the fourth running back, then can Velus Jones still be the fifth or sixth wide receiver? Or is DeAndre Carter the fifth or sixth wide receiver? Is Dante Pettis the fifth or sixth wide receiver? And which of those three guys are going to be primary on the return game? I suppose Josh Blackwell at cornerback is also in that conversation. Tyler Scott's in the return conversation. Khalil Herbert's in the return conversation. But it generally feels like between Velus Jones, DeAndre Carter, and Dante Pettis, they're not going to keep more than one of those guys purely for their return ability. They have to be able to contribute as more than just returners in those spots. And how you sort of head-to-head those guys, their skills at wide receiver / running back, their skills on the special teams coverage units, in addition to their skills as a return man, is something that's going to be impossible for us on the outside to really properly predict here. Similar thing is tough to predict on the offensive line, where the Bears have injury-based decisions that are going to be pretty difficult here. Again, it's possible that by the time you hear this podcast, they will have made some of these big decisions, so I apologize. But it's more so to set the stage for the comparison to last year. But Larry Borom is injured, and whether he goes on injured reserve and when he goes on injured reserve will be an interesting question. How much they trust then, Karan Amagaji as the potential backup tackle. They've talked about how they like Matt Pryor as a potential swing tackle and swing guard. And then you also have Ryan Bates injured at center. So do you keep a third center like Doug Kramer, even just temporarily, while Ryan Bates still gets healthy? Or is Bates going to be ready? Or can they trust that Bates will be ready to go for week one so they don't need to keep an extra center just in case? But if Matt Pryor is going to have to be your swing tackle, do you get to keep an extra guard like Bill Murray? We know they've already released Ja'Tari Carter, who was on this roster last season and has appeared in a handful of games for this team over the last couple of seasons. But Bill Murray is, as I'm recording this at least, still an option for them to keep as maybe a ninth offensive lineman as a guard. They also have Jake Curhan, the offensive tackle, who's played some guard before with Shane Waldron in Seattle. So they've got a few different options on this offensive line that will depend purely on how injured Larry Borum and Ryan Bates are. And that's just not information that we are going to have outside of the organization and be able to then effectively predict what the Bears are going to do. Similar conversation at defensive tackle. We talked about this a little bit on is that Monday's podcast or Friday's podcast? I was been sick over the weekend, and the days are blending together in my head. I think it was Friday's. No, it was Monday's podcast. Anyway, Zach Pickens injured at defensive tackle. They traded for Chris Williams from the Cleveland Browns. But because Pickens is hurt, does that mean they keep Byron Cowart as a fifth defensive tackle? Do they go outside of the organization for another defensive tackle while Pickens continues to recover? Or do they just say, we can get by with three, just one backup for the two interior spots with Chris Williams while Pickens gets better for however long he's going to need to get better, knowing that DeMarcus Walker can kick inside and play defensive tackle sometimes and that they can move a few different guys around. And maybe then, because if maybe they'll kick Walker inside a little bit more. Does that mean they get to keep an extra defensive end where, Dominique Robinson and Daniel Hardy are really fighting for, can they be that fifth defensive end with Sweat and Walker and Booker? And then, of course, they traded for Darrell Taylor from the Seattle Seahawks. So there's a lot of different areas of movement here on this Bears roster, some of which is injury-based, but a lot of it is these are really talented players. I mean, even the backup cornerback spots with Blackwell and Jalen Jones and Greg Stroman, it's not like, crap, the Bears don't have a good backup offensive tackle they want to keep. It's like, well, they're injured, so how do you sort of work around that? Or it's, they don't have a talented backup cornerback they want to keep. Well, it's like, you'd love to keep Stroman and Jalen Jones and Josh Blackwell. They've all made plays this preseason. They all have special teams value. You just don't have enough room on the team right now for a lot of the talented players that you're getting rid of. It certainly wouldn't surprise me if a few of these guys the Bears end up landing on other teams. And usually the Bears are the team that are out there taking other teams' trash. Trash is harsh, but taking other teams' cuts. Other teams' trash becomes Bears' treasure, but other teams' cuts end up coming here. The Bears add at the 53-man roster cut down a little bit more than they give away to other rosters. But it feels like this year, they could be a couple of players on each side of the ball that go the other direction, although the Bears are also still looking out for players to add their own way. It's not like their roster is untouchable based on the other talent that's out there. Heck, that's why they traded for Chris Williams and Darrell Taylor, because they wanted to add more at that spot. But the quality of the players we're talking about here in these most difficult decisions provides a pretty stark contrast to the quality of players we were talking about in these decisions last year, and certainly the year before that, when they were really tearing down this Bears roster. So I want to look back to last year to kind of compare just how much progress this team has made, and then also look head-to-head, and not just from a cut perspective, but also the players they're going to be counting on next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, America's #1 sportsbook. And right now, FanDuel has something a little bit different for you, because now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment. And of course, you can cancel at any time. All you have to do is place that $5 bet on any of your favorite teams. You can already bet on Week 1, Bears versus Titans, where Chicago continues to be a 4.5-point home favorite in that matchup. The money line is set at Bears -215. The over/under is at 43.5 points for that point total. But you can also bet on the Coach of the Year odds for Matt Eberflus. You can bet on Offensive Rookie of the Year odds for Caleb Williams. You can bet on which rookie quarterback's going to have the most passing yards and which rookie receiver is going to have the most receiving yards, plus all your other favorite sports, baseball, tennis, soccer, the combat sports, all going on right now, all in the FanDuel app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. So to get your free 3-week trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. We've come a long way from the types of roster decisions we were talking about with this Bears team last year. And I went back and actually listened to a couple of the podcasts, the Locked On Bears podcasts we did this exact time of year a year ago when we were looking at the initial 53-man roster cutdown, when the Bears traded for Dan Feeney from the Miami Dolphins for a 6th-round pick to try and bolster the offensive line, similar to the Bears trading for Darrell Taylor and Chris Williams, although I would argue Taylor's a little bit better than Feeney or Williams in terms of what they've been able to prove at this stage of their careers. But there were still some of these kind of decisions of players who are a step below what the Bears are trying to decide between right now. You know, I look back at a couple of spots in particular that stand out to me. Like, for example, I actually pulled the little graphic we used for the Bears roster last season. And like on the offense, for example, on the offensive line, one of the big decisions the Bears were trying to decide was, okay, do we keep Alex Leatherwood as a guard? They tried him at guard. They tried him at tackle. They had obviously claimed him on waivers the year before and had a big contract there, and they were trying to find a position to have him be on this offensive line. It was kind of like Alex Leatherwood and Larry Borum were your top tackle options there with some guard versatility from both of them. They still had Aviante Collins, who's a 3rd stringer for the Bears now, but was kind of a 2nd stringer for them back then. And at guard, they were trying to decide between Alex Leatherwood and Jatari Carter. And then, Dieter Iselin were the top backup guards. And the Bears cut Jatari Carter on Monday after keeping him on the 53-man roster last year. And Dieter Iselin was also cut on Monday from his team. I saw it on Twitter, and now I can't remember what team he was playing for. I want to say the Texans, but yes, confirming that it is indeed the Houston Texans cut Dieter Iselin. So like the types of players the Bears were trying to decide between are all getting cut this year, including the ones that the Bears kept the last season. Like the Bears already cut Carter and said, yeah, we were already upgraded from the guy we had to decide to end up keeping last season on the offensive line. Same kind of thing on the defensive line last year, where they were trying to figure out their pass rush as well. And, instead of getting Terrell Lewis, of course, Terrell Smith, getting ahead of myself. Not Terrell Smith, Daryl, Jesus. There's Terrell Lewis, there's Terrell Smith, and then the one they just traded for is Darrell Taylor. Too many Darrells and Terrells and Taylors and Lewises. Instead of trading for Terrell Lewis, or excuse me, Darrell, Jesus, I can't do this right now. Terrell Lewis was on the roster last season. That's what's mixing me up here. Instead of trading for Darrell Taylor, they were trying to decide between Terrell Lewis. Gosh, this is gonna get me for the rest of the day now. It was Dominique Robinson and Trevis Gibson and Terrell Lewis last season for that last defensive end spot. It was Yannick Ngakoue, DeMarcus Walker, and Rasheem Green were your 1, 2, and 3. And then it was like Robinson versus Trevis Gibson as the recent draft picks, plus Terrell Lewis, who had a strong preseason. They end up cutting Lewis and Gibson and hold on to Dominique Robinson as the number 4. And already now this year, we're talking about, well, Robinson is at best number 5 and might not make this team. Trevis Gibson just got traded to the Seattle Seahawks of all teams. And of course, the Bears ended up cutting Terrell Lewis last season as well anyway. But like these guys that the Bears cut last season are below where the Bears are now. And the guy the Bears kept, Dominique Robinson, might not, and I'm guessing maybe by the time you listen to this podcast, will have already been cut from this Bears roster. So like the guys were kind of, going back and forth on last season of like, oh man, who should they keep? Who should they take? Like, not even real strong considerations at this point in the process this season. Even on the defensive line, which is still a position of weakness on this Bears team, even the weaker spots are upgraded. Like, I think back to like guys who were on the roster bubble last season, just like the names. Kindle Vildor at cornerback was right in that mix of like, will he make the team or will he not? Ends up going to the Lions and has a pretty big embarrassing play in the NFC Championship game, but like, that's the kind of player. Or like your top backup strong safety. Your backup to Jaquan Brisker last preseason at 53-man roster cutdown day was 7th-round pick Kendall Williamson, who they ended up cutting and replacing with Quindell Johnson, who they claimed on waivers from the Chargers, who the Bears just cut on Monday. So the guy who the Bears saw as the upgrade last season that they wanted to claim off another team's waiver wire is now someone who's not good enough to make this team and cut him. Same thing with the defensive end, Khalid Kareem. They claimed on waivers last season to bring in as some more defensive line depth. They cut him this season because the roster is that much farther ahead now than where it was the year before. It's not just the top, it's the depth here, right? These are not even the starters we're talking about, the upgrades of, even the backups. The Bears are able to cut the guys they really felt like they had to find a way to keep last season. And the other one I'll throw in here, last year, your quarterback 3 was Nathan Peterman. And not that like Brett Rippon is some amazing quarterback who's worlds ahead of Nathan Peterman, but I think it's worth keeping in mind or noting that Nathan Peterman was initially with the Saints this offseason, and then they cut him in early August. And then the Las Vegas Raiders added him in mid-August, like mid-training camp. And, I mean, as I'm recording this, technically he has not yet been cut by the Raiders, but, like, he's at best their number 3 quarterback. So if they keep 3, I guess it's going to be Nathan Peterman. But otherwise, of course, it's Minshew and Aiden O'Connell with the Raiders. So, like, not that Brett Rippon is some huge upgrade, but like the guy who was QB3 last season and for a time seemed to be QB2 ahead of Tyson Bagent on the unofficial depth chart, like can barely stick on a training camp roster now because of where Bagent is, because of course where Caleb Williams is, and because Austin Reed showed you some impressive things, and Brett Rippon had a couple of nice drives this preseason. Even from a year ago, this roster is worlds ahead, and I don't even recommend going and looking 2 years ago when they were really tearing down before they got the number 1 overall pick that season. By that time we were talking about claiming, Emir Smith-Marset. You had Byron Pringle as one of your top wide receivers. Trevor Siemian was your backup quarterback at that time. Sam Mustipher on the offensive line. I apologize for the PTSD that some of these names might give you. Al-Qadim Muhammad at defensive end. They claimed Armon Watts on waivers from the Minnesota Vikings. Travis Gibson was starting opposite Robert Quinn to start that season, and Nicholas Morrow was your linebacker next to Roquan Smith. Like, we've come a long way in just a couple of seasons, and I think it puts it in good perspective where this Bears overall roster strength is now compared to where it was then. And it really puts all of it on the coaching staff now, right? It's like, okay, roster looks pretty good at a few different spots. The depth is even good. So if you have a couple injuries, like obviously injuries are going to be detrimental and important and meaningful, but like also you're in a better position there too than you were before. So like Shane Waldron, Matt Eberflus, Eric Washington, let's go. It's go time. You got players. Show us, win some of these games. Particularly, I think it's worth noting the upgrades at the top. Now that we're actually at 53-man roster day, in the offseason, you can compare rosters to rosters, but until you actually see how the team comes together for week 1, you don't really know exactly what the upgrades are going to look like. But we have a more complete picture of like, hey, here's exactly where the Bears have gotten better, almost entirely across the board. It's hard. I don't think you can find any spot where the Bears got worse. It's just a matter of, did they make a huge upgrade or maybe just a slight upgrade? So I want to compare exactly where the Bears have made that progress in the starting lineup, or at least, the guys that are going to make the most impact this season, next on Locked On Bears. We've spent a lot of time in the offseason, thinking about when and where the Bears got better. But I think as the preseason and training camp comes to an end, and as we have a sense of like where the moves have paid off and where we still have questions or concerns or doubts or, just answers still needed, it really, I think, hammers home just what Ryan Poles has been able to accomplish on this team, even just in this one offseason. When you think about specifically what the upgrades have been and how much of an upgrade they represent over what the Bears started with last season, it's easy to buy into the Bears certainly winning more than the 7 games they won last season. I believe the over-under on FanDuel is set at 8.5 wins, and I lean the over there as well, but certainly more than the 7 that they had last season because of just how many different places you can point to this team being better. Like, yes, we were just talking about the depth and the cutdown decisions, but like, let's not miss the forest for the trees here. Like, the quarterback position from Justin Fields to Caleb Williams is going to be an upgrade. How much of an upgrade? you can't get the expectations too high for the rookie season. But like we saw we saw Justin Fields struggle in Pittsburgh and not be able to cleanly beat out Russell Wilson, in terms of that starting job. As far as I'm recording this, that's not locked in yet, but it's all signs point to Russell Wilson continuing to be the starter there as expected. And we saw Fields make some mistakes in the preseason, a lot more than Caleb Williams did in the preseason. Smaller sample size, different situations, of course, but like that's going to be an upgrade, at least in the passing game, for the Chicago Bears. At running back, you still have Khalil Herbert, but you add DeAndre Swift to the top of that depth chart. That's an upgrade. I mean, you could say you're swapping out maybe Dante Foreman for DeAndre Swift if you're looking for a one-to-one player, and you go from Herbert as your lead back to DeAndre Swift as your lead back and Herbert as your second or third back. That's an upgrade in the backfield. The Bears are absolutely better at running back now than they were 12 months ago. The biggest change is the obvious one at wide receiver, where you go from Darnell Mooney to Keenan Allen. And no disrespect to Darnell Mooney, who got a decent contract from the Falcons. And, we like Darnell Mooney and are rooting for Darnell Mooney. But Keenan Allen is like a, future Hall of Fame type conversation player. And that's a different debate. But, regardless, Pro Bowl, legit, 1,000-yard guy every year. And Mooney had a 1,000-yard season, but hasn't been able to recreate that and is definitely not in the same tier as Keenan Allen. Like, it's a huge upgrade for the Bears, and it's no disrespect to Darnell Mooney to say Keenan Allen is better than him, because Keenan Allen's better than most receivers, a lot of receivers in the NFL. The even bigger upgrade was like, we started 2023 last season with Chase Claypool as your number 3 wide receiver on the depth chart. It was DJ Moore, Darnell Mooney, Chase Claypool, Tyler Scott, Equanimous St. Brown, Velus Jones. Chase Claypool was the number 3 option there. So to replace that with Rome Odunze, even in a rookie, in a rookie form, where he's going to probably make some mistakes here and there, like astronomical upgrade over Chase Claypool. Like to have that kind of, just to see that side to side, they go from Fields, Herbert, Mooney, and Claypool to Williams, Swift, Keenan Allen, and Rome Odunze is bigger than I know. Like each of those things kind of happened incrementally, one at a time, but like when you see it all together, it's like, whoa, yeah, they should be like way better just from a talent standpoint. And that's not even including the offensive coordinator change, which I think we spent a lot of time feeling like was one of the bigger problems on offense. Like it wasn't that Fields was terrible or that Mooney was terrible, but that maybe they weren't elite and the play calling and game planning wasn't helping and wasn't getting the most out of those players. So you upgrade that and the talent. I mean, I don't want to overlook, Gerald Everett coming in as the number 2 tight end is a huge upgrade over Robert Tonyan, who was good for a drop or two, and that was about it. But Everett's a much more dynamic receiving weapon at tight end. And then the offensive line is pretty much the same, but Lucas Patrick to Coleman Shelton feels like at worst, a slight upgrade, maybe even, but certainly like Lucas Patrick was not good. Coleman Shelton, I think, I don't want to get carried away with him because I think he's okay. And he should be better than Lucas Patrick. It might not be astronomically better, but like a better defense, a better center position when you add Ryan Bates into the mix as well. The Bears are better off at center right now than they were last year. And there is not a position on offense. And I don't think there's one on defense either, but especially not on offense, a position where you got worse in any way. Everyone either got better or is the same player from last year with another year of experience. It's absolutely going to be a huge step forward from a talent standpoint. Defensively, fewer changes overall, but still some really important ones. Obviously, last season, week 1 started with your starters as DeMarcus Walker and Yannick Ngakoue. Let's not discount the fact that you're starting with Montez Sweat. Like I know he came in halfway through last season, but he didn't come in at 100% in terms of knowing the defense and being comfortable here right away. So we got maybe a third of a season of peak Montez Sweat. It's going to be a huge upgrade to start the season with peak Montez Sweat as one of your starting defensive ends. And it's obvious, and so we haven't really talked about it that much this offseason, but like it's worth making sure that we like recognize and celebrate that. And your number 3 defensive end, we talked about Rasheem Green earlier. You replace him with Darrell Taylor or Austin Booker in that mix. Like your defensive end depth is instantly stronger than it was last season. The 2 other spots where there were big changes is defensive tackle, Jaron Dexter in for Justin Jones, and then free safety, Kevin Byard in for Eddie Jackson. And I'm not ready to declare either one of those an obvious upgrade yet. Doesn't mean they're going to be worse either, but like I still need Jaron Dexter to prove a lot to me. I don't think Justin Jones was great. So it's not like Javon Dexter has to be great. I still want to see what that looks like, how much of an upgrade that ends up being. And then Kevin Byard for Eddie Jackson. Like, we loved Eddie Jackson. And yeah, maybe he had lost a step or whatever, but Kevin Byard may have too. So like, they should be fine at both of those positions. But I'm not going to sit here and say, oh yeah, the Bears made a huge upgrade at defensive tackle and free safety, because maybe. We'll see. Like, to me, those are both, jury's still out how much of an upgrade those two might be. But they are notable key changes from last season to this season's Week 1 roster. And we got to leave a second for special teams, right? Torrey Taylor over Trenton Gill as a punter definitely looks like a huge upgrade. Gill had a really big punt for the Broncos over the weekend, but he's kicking in Denver in the altitude, so I don't know if that quite is perfectly accurate of a representation of his improvement, him being that much better, or him just being in a better punting situation. But regardless, the Bears are in a better punting situation with Torrey Taylor right now than they were with Trenton Gill last season. That's another spot, albeit a small one, but another spot where the upgrade is visible. So you've got, we just went through, I actually didn't count them, but like 8 or 9 or 10 different, like not all starters, but key contributors on both sides of the ball where the Bears got better. And we went through all the different depth spots where the Bears have better talent they're trying to decide for their 53-man roster now than they tried to make last year. That is an improved roster, top to bottom, all around. And like I said, it all falls then on the coaching staff. You've got talented players. You're not going to have that excuse of like, well, the offense isn't getting anything going, but they don't have any receivers and the quarterback is mediocre or whatever. Like, nope, you got receivers and you've got a quarterback now. Or okay, the defense is struggling, but they don't have a pass rusher. They might not. That's still a legit question. But you got Montez Sweat, you got DeMarcus Walker. Everyone's raving about Javon Dexter. Like, at some point, the excuses won't be able to hold up. Not that they've been skating by on excuses that much in the past, but like, there's not going to be room for many of them this season without some other new external, extenuating circumstances from that we can't foresee or predict at this point. But like, roster's pretty set. So now we can really get a good sense of what this coaching staff is going to bring, what they can do with some real talent without talent being able to be the thing you can point to as really holding them back. I think it's a lot of credit to Ryan Poles, who's done a really good job building this roster. And I think we also don't always appreciate, like, yes, he's made a couple mistakes with Chase Claypool and Alex Leatherwood and a couple others, but like, he's been pretty solid in a lot of the biggest areas, and his GM batting average has got to be higher than most GMs across the NFL. But the coaching side has to be one part of that batting average too, and that's what's going to determine what the Bears are and aren't able to win and achieve this season. We'll keep close tabs on what the Bears decide to do with this 53-man roster. I'm still trying to figure out podcast scheduling this week, because tomorrow, or Tuesday, as this podcast comes out, is 53-man roster cutdown day. So we'll know the initial 53. We'll also get a Hard Knocks episode Tuesday night. And usually the Wednesday podcast is recapping the episode of Hard Knocks. So 53-man roster's got to take importance here. So we're going to talk 53-man roster on tomorrow's podcast. But then they'll do the practice squad additions and stuff on Wednesday and change the 53-man roster more. So we might talk about that on Thursday. So then do we wait until Friday to talk about Hard Knocks? Or do we just not take a whole day to talk about Hard Knocks? Maybe a bonus podcast to do Hard Knocks? I haven't figured that out yet. But that's why you have to subscribe to Locked On Bears to make sure you don't miss all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis, whether it's on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And that includes your fantasy football team as well. For your second listen, check out the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast with daily insight on the best fantasy draft strategies and waiver wire decisions, lineup choices, you name it. They've got it all at Locked On Fantasy Football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Then make sure you come back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity to bear down.